right, well, thank you very much for coming to the last session here of day 2. It's been a wonderful conference, and before I go too much further, I do want to have a quick shout out to the conference organizing team who've done an amazing job of curating all these events and making this event so successful. So thank you very much, Julia and team. It's not lost on me that the only thing between you and our networking event or dinner or perhaps even your families is yet another blockchain panel. So we will get down to the task at hand, which is to talk about Project Jasper and the third phase of our collaborative research work. On stage with me, I've got John Lee from the TMX, Scott Hendry from the Bank of Canada, John Villaserios from Accenture. I'm Andrew McCormick, and there's my name and title in giant font, in case you don't believe me. Project Jasper, for the uninitiated, has been our now multi-year collaborative research project involving, led by Payments Canada and the Bank of Canada, involving the financial industry here in Canada and the technology vendor community in the blockchain DLT space. Initially, not surprisingly, we focused on our knitting, which was payments, clearing, and settlement, and specifically the domestic high-value interbank payments space. Last year, around this time, we published our second phase report, a fairly detailed white paper, which presumably is still available online. And some of our key findings, and the kind of Cole's notes on that are that certainly the technology over the course of time that we've been looking at it has been maturing in terms of privacy, in terms of confidentiality and scalability. That the technology we proved could be used to build out meet our functional requirements and our high-level requirements. But we did conclude last year that it wasn't obvious that this blockchain DLT technology was entirely fit for purpose for our critical infrastructure and albeit slightly narrow use case, a small group of bank participants solving one particular payments function within the ecosystem. The promise of blockchain technology is obviously that it can bring together a more diverse group of participants and reimagine business processes or, quite frankly, define new ways of interacting. And so we challenged ourselves, being the innovative and forward-thinking types that we are, to expand our scope and introduce more complexity and introduce a much wider group of stakeholders and look at additional functionality, in particular equities clearing and settlement, in addition to the cash on ledger schemes that we had developed in the earlier rounds. So enter the TMX group, who run the Canadian Depository for Securities and the clearing and settlement processes for equities, exchange-traded equities, and a variety of other asset classes. We also engage with Accenture and again with R3 to keep building on the momentum from a technology perspective that we had already gained in our earlier work. The objective here is then to hunt for and define clear benefits of using this technology within our ecosystem. Again, this round, we looked at the end-to-end post-trade settlement lifecycle of an on-ledger asset being exchange, delivery versus payment, and hopefully find efficiencies in terms of liquidity efficiency, in terms of improving collateral management, reducing risk, and hopefully reducing reconciliation costs for this now more diverse group of participants within this ecosystem. We now have broker-dealers, we've got the CSD, the bank, the operator, and so our intention is, again, to sort of hunt for really material benefits as to why we would do this, and justify a potential future state financial market infrastructure. We basically gave ourselves 3 months to completely reinvent the financial market infrastructure. So with that, I'm glad to hand the spotlight over to John Lee to go into much more detail.
Thanks, Andrew. Oh, wow, there's my name and title in big, bold lights. I'm going to just move on from there. So Jasper Phase III. When we originally had the conversation, actually it was at the Payments Canada Summit a year ago. Andrew and I were catching up, we were having breakfast, and the results of Jasper Phase II were coming out. And for those that kind of were following the whole Jasper series of project, at the broad strokes, it looked a little bit disappointing, where the results kind of came and it was sort of there, but not really. But there was a little silver lining in there where it said if it dealt with just cash and cash transactions, it's somewhat limited in its benefits. And Andrew came and we started brainstorming a little bit and we started thinking about, wait a minute, if you think about a transaction, sure, there's a cash movement piece of it, but but why? Why are you moving that cash? You've clearly bought something or you've sold something. There needs to be an asset in that mix. And so this is where we started thinking, can we use securities as that asset to actually go and experiment, to understand what that operating model would look like if you had a Canadian fiat currency on a blockchain with something you can actually buy and sell with. So when you looked at the overall scope of what Jasper Phase III would be, we kind of took those broad strokes, those principles, and we realized, sure, we can go and experiment and do that. We can do that alone. Does that make sense? Probably not. Obviously, having the participation with the Bank of Canada, with Payments Canada, and with R3 and Accenture to actually help us move forward with the actual prototype, we've realized that doing this in a collaborative fashion would help us understand some of the assumptions that we made. If you think about the whole concept of tokenization and what that actually is, people always talk about this new tokenized world is going to go and reinvent how the securities industries is going to work today. Well, we're not entirely sure about that, but we sure wanted to find out. We wanted to double down. We weren't going to shy away from it. We wanted to truly understand, is there an actual benefit or not? So as we started going through and looking at the details, we've realized, wait a minute, if you think about institutional cash movement with LVTS, those customers are the large commercial banks. In our depository at the TMX Group, it's much more than that. We've got broker-dealers. And so you've realized right away, the very first challenge that we had, it's not a one-to-one mapping. Oh my God, what do we do? So we needed to understand the whole concept of credit and credit extension and how we would actually allow broker-dealers that, quite frankly, don't have a tremendously large balance sheet like our commercial banks do, to actually go and do an atomic settlement. Settlements, that's the last piece. If you think about what our depository does today, it is one of the most efficient depositories in the world. We're 99% dematerialized. We have a tremendous amount of novation and netting processes that take place, and we transact over $1 trillion worth of assets on any given day. Great. Can that be improved? Can you go and reinvent the wheel? We're not sure. So that's where we went to. What do we want to capture out of Jasper Phase III? If you think about value and the whole value enablement, a lot of these assumptions around how you can get more efficiencies using tokenization, assets on a common ledger. We took a very, very basic approach and put cash and securities on the same ledger, which then would allow for the transfer of stores of value, tokens. Can you actually lend that out? A lot of these questions we are looking to answer. And the idea there is that it would actually open up to a whole new set of market opportunities that, quite frankly, may not have been possible with the conventional stack that we have. With that, I'll hand it over to Scott.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out. So I get to talk about the key lessons learned. What did we take away from the experiment that we did? One of the main benefits that was just talked about, or motivations for distributed ledger and blockchain, is the possibility for cost savings for the participants, for the settlement of transactions. So through the first two phases of Jasper and continuing in this one, we wanted to dive deeper on where were the cost savings, how big were they? And as was mentioned, in the first two phases, we didn't see a lot of cost savings for the main operation of the system, so we wanted to look at the possibility of savings for the participants themselves. So we were able to dive down a little bit deeper on that in Phase 3 here, but we're still uncertain, actually, after doing this work, that there is significant savings possible for the participants. And most of that is to do with the type of experiment that we actually did and where we drew the boundary for what was put on ledger. In the experiment that we've done, we allowed CDS to do the netting and novation that they currently do, and then we did the settlement on the ledger. So it's not the full process of post-trade settlement steps that's on the ledger. It's only a portion of it. And with only that portion, it's not clear that all the participant dealers and banks are going to get a significant benefit out of this settlement system. There's a lot of evidence that you'd have to have a lot more of the full post-trade settlement process, including the netting and the novation, on the ledger to get benefit. And you might even need the transaction itself, the trade at the very beginning on ledger to realize the benefits that distributed ledger promises to deliver. I'll get into a little bit more of this in a second. The main point we spent a lot of time talking about during the development was how do you handle it when you have LVTS on the payment side and CDS on the equity side, and they have different participants in each system. And those differences in participants are driven part by legislation, part by the policies imposed by regulators like myself. So we have to make sure that those rules and regulations are not violated when you put everything on the same ledger. So we were a little uncertain, and we had a lot of discussions about how all this was done, but we were able to develop a combination of services through a doorman service, through the involvement of a notary in the R3 Corda setup, where they're involved in each transaction's verification, and the use of the smart contract itself. So all of these together are able to deliver a system where we can be certain that the participants are able to do only what they're approved to do. And that can be important, again, when there's different qualifications across the two systems. Credit is very important in the current system for a couple of different reasons. Primarily to get necessary liquidity to actually do the settlement. This is true for the distributed ledger blockchain side as well. You need to have, or it's much better to have credit in the system in order to get settlement and grease the wheels and get things done. So we were able to show that it is possible to have a simple version of credit in our distributed ledger system. This is only one way that CDS and the current settlement system adds liquidity, and it makes it possible for the participants to get the liquidity they need to settle their transactions. So there's a lot more that needs to be investigated going forward in terms of other liquidity mechanisms, but this was one of the main ones that we wanted to look at, and it is possible to get a simple version of credit into the system, and we have to look further going forward at whether more complex interactions involving credit are possible. So the last lesson here is to do mostly with next steps. How do we see things going forward? So as I mentioned in the first bullet, we're still a little uncertain about what all the payoffs are from moving a core system like this into a distributed ledger platform. But we're open to the possibility. And what we keep encountering is that these small extensions aren't really showing the big benefit that we thought we might see from distributed ledger. And it may only be through something that is much more ambitious, either the full, complete revisioning of the financial system, or certainly a lot more than we've considered so far, to get more assets on ledger, or more of the trade and settlement and clearing process on ledger, or more participants, in order to generate a significant cost savings for the participants and improve functionality and benefits for the wider financial sector. So there's still promise. We don't want to be giving a really negative message here. We see that there is promise in distributed ledger, but when you're looking at core systems that are systemically important and have been optimized over 20 years or more, the bar is very high for this alternative technology to offer significant benefit. So we're still stretching to see where we have to define the scope to really get the big payoffs that this technology could promise. Now I want to pause here and give my colleagues an opportunity to offer further insights on what they see of lessons.
Scott, I guess one observation on a key lesson learned is that by having a common platform that you can have multiple participants, be it on the equity or the cash side or any other part of the infrastructure, that you can benefit from using that common platform versus having multiple silos of technologies that you have to integrate and bring in and do a lot of complex integration work that puts it all together. So just an observation that we see that you can manage all that through the smart contracts, through the notary, and through the doorman service that we have as part of the platform, instead of having to do lots of complex integration.
So I think one of the key lessons that we looked at was the scope of what we actually picked was equities. And if you think about exchange traded derivatives as an example, where you can start leveraging smart contract logic, if you think about the overhaul or the reimagining of the middle and back office functions in our participants, a lot of these things do create additional complexities that we didn't actually go into a deep dive into. If you think about the ability to actually go and realize some of these benefits and just how nascent the technology is, I think there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. But having said all that, I mean, let's face it, it worked. You know, there was an ability to actually demonstrate, you know, a transactional value of securities against a cash leg. And I thought that was a tremendous accomplishment. Identifying a lot of the challenges that lay ahead, I think we've literally touched the tip of the iceberg. A lot of complexities that started to kind of rear its ugly head. We took some very, very basic assumptions and kind of parked those. And you know, it's very obvious that in order for this to be fully realized, you need to go through that list to really vet these things out, because there is a lot of complexity that does still exist that, quite frankly, we didn't have the time to go through.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot to add there. I think in summary, what we're saying is we feel that there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of complexity. You know, we had to break our own rules to even make our simplistic model work. So, you know, if we're thinking about financial market infrastructures, there's definitely a longer road ahead. Not to say that this technology won't play a meaningful role in the future, but if we're looking for that killer app to get DLT, you know, into production. Personally, I think we're going to be finding that emerging probably in more greenfield spaces where, you know, there's no incumbent system to displace. There's perhaps a different regulatory environment or a different sensitivity to risk, and where value can be extracted immediately, whether it's in the identity space, provenance of goods, or trade finance. There are definitely areas where we're seeing traction, and I think we'll continue to do our hard work here in the middle to reimagine what it could be for financial market infrastructures, and it's our job to do that. But I wouldn't be surprised if the killer app emerges somewhere else, and over time we realize some benefits here in our world.
Okay, thank you. And at this time, I'll turn it over to John to talk about the global landscape.
So I'm quite fortunate in that my role at Accenture, I look after a lot of the areas within the global perspective. I tend to work with a lot of different institutions in different parts of the world. What I actually wanted to share with you is sort of a different perspective of what's happening around the world with regards to central bank digital currency, CBDC, in the wholesale space. So this slide is actually just paints a picture of what's going on the trend that's emerging around the world with regards to central bank digital currencies, and obviously part of this dialogue as well. And what you see here is a variety of different countries that are embarked on this journey, started on this journey, and they're at different areas or different sort of levels of adoption, starting from the level of interest all the way through to experimentation, and hopefully we'll see some implementation in the next short while as well. What we mean by this is sort of experimentation in that there's POCs, but implementations being sort of more production-grade rollouts. So the trend is there. It's emerging. That map is going to get more colored, I think, over the next couple of years. And there's more and more that we're seeing, especially because it solves some very systemic problems or challenges that some of these countries have. And as a result, they're looking to this technology for adoption on a global basis. One of the things I also want to mention, I guess, is some of the emerging trends. So just as I mentioned before, I guess projects are sort of pivoting. They're going from POCs, proof of concepts, to pilots, and they're getting into the production phase of implementation. So we're seeing this now. We expect to see a lot more of that in the upcoming this year and next year. We're actually seeing quite a lot of work happening in the space. Also, the technology is evolving into a state of readiness. A lot of this technology that we've been working with has been release version one of everything that we've been touching, but now it's becoming more and more mature. There's investment that's being made into the space, lots of investment and a lot of focused energy that's being made to mature the technology. So it's becoming more and more ready for prime time or more for production implementations. Global central banks, as we talked about before, are experimenting and beginning to put cash on ledger from an experimentation perspective. This project is an example. But at the end of the day, this is absolutely a fundamental requirement. When you talk about assets and cash, you need to have both sides of this equation in order to have a complete end-to-end story. Otherwise, you're just solving half the problem. So it's a very interesting dimension, and we see a lot of that in terms of levels of interest with the organizations that we work with, and also the trend that's emerging, and so on. So all of that is going on ledger. So putting both assets and cash is a very important part of the complete picture. Also, the concept, I guess, immediate transaction finality provides sort of a very positive impact on liquidity efficiency. And that's an interesting area for many in the financial market infrastructure space, because the promise that can actually bring. And delivery versus payment, reduces the counterparty risks and the credit risks that are associated with dealing in this kind of an environment, and having this kind of technology allows you to combine both of these things in order to create sort of a more structured transactional system. Finally, I just want to leave with a couple of different points. One is there's an increasing level of interest, not only in what you've seen sort of on the map and on the slide before, but on the cross-border dimension of this. There's a lot of, I guess, views about using this technology for solving cross-border problems, because in both of in that scenario, you have different types of technologies, different business problems, and entirely different infrastructure, and this technology can bridge a lot of that stuff together and bring it all together. And this is sort of, at the end, it just brings us closer to where Jasper III has actually been doing as part of the project, and brings us one step closer to achieving the future financial marketplace. So on that note, I want to say thank you very much, and maybe hand it back to Andrew for close off.
I think that's it. We'll be available later on if anyone wants to approach us and talk further on a one-on-one basis at the networking event. And otherwise, I'll pass it over to Bruce to close off the day. Thank you.